Imagine this: you are just hours away from facing your own death. The executioner is already preparing the noose, or double-checking that the lethal injection needles are working perfectly. Suddenly, a guard looks you in the eye and asks one final question: what do you want for your last meal? For most of us, a last meal would be a farewell banquet of our favorite comfort foods. But for some of the most twisted minds in criminal history, this moment became the perfect opportunity to leave one last macabre message, perform a disturbing ritual, or simply prove they didn't feel a single ounce of regret. In this video, we are diving deep into the dark biographies, the ruthless crimes, and the deeply unsettling last meals of the world's worst killers. Stay tuned until the very end, because our final case will prove to you that, even on death row, malice and madness know absolutely no bounds. Turn up the volume, because we are getting started. Victor Harry Feger was a drifter and a con artist who wandered from town to town committing minor offenses, until the summer of 1960, when he arrived in Dubuque, Iowa. Feger possessed a cold, calculating mind and a sinister plan. He wanted to kidnap a doctor to rob him of prescription drugs and cash. Upon arriving in town, he began calling local physicians at random under the guise that his wife needed urgent medical attention. Dr. Edward Bartles, a young 34-year-old physician, a devoted family man, and a highly respected member of his community, fell right into the trap. When Dr. Bartles arrived at the supposed emergency site, Feger held him at gunpoint and kidnapped him. Feger forced the doctor to drive across state lines into a barren field in Illinois. There, without a shred of mercy, he shot him in the back of the head. Dr. Bartles' body was found days later in a cornfield. Feger tried to sell the doctor's car in Alabama, which immediately raised red flags. He was arrested by the FBI after a brief pursuit. Although he tried to plead insanity and claimed someone else had killed the doctor, the evidence was overwhelming. He was sentenced to death for federal kidnapping and murder. Feger completely baffled the guards at Fort Madison Penitentiary with his request. He didn't want banquets, meat, or sweets. He asked only for a single olive with the pit still inside. After he was executed by hanging on March 15, 1963, the medical examiners found the olive pit inside the pocket of the suit he was buried in. Feger firmly believed that, once buried, an olive tree would sprout from his body as a monument of peace to wash away his sins. The profile and the double life. John Wayne Gacy is one of the most infamous serial killers in U.S. history. To his neighbors in Chicago, Illinois, Gacy was an exemplary citizen, a successful construction contractor, an active member of the local Democratic Party, and a beloved entertainer who dressed up as Pogo the Clown to comfort orphaned and sick children in hospitals. But behind this model citizen facade hid a sadistic predator. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy lured dozens of teenage boys and young men to his home with false promises of high-paying construction jobs, or by simply offering them a ride. Once inside his home, Gacy subjected them to unimaginable torture, horrific abuse, and slowly strangled them using a makeshift tourniquet. He murdered a total of 33 young men. The most gruesome part of his case is that he buried 26 of them in the crawl space beneath his own house, a damp, incredibly tight area. His victims were vulnerable kids. The youngest was just 14 years old, Robert Piest, whose disappearance in 1978 finally led police to search Gacy's home and uncover the putrid smell rising from the floorboards. Before becoming a full-time killer, Gacy had actually managed 3 Kentucky Fried Chicken (KFC) restaurants. For his final meal on May 10, 1994, before receiving the lethal injection, he ordered a feast that took him back to his old days. A bucket of 12 original recipe KFC chicken pieces, 10 French fries, a side of fried shrimp, a bowl of fresh strawberries. Gacy showed absolutely zero remorse. His final words before dying on the execution gurney were directed at the guards and witnesses: "Kiss my ass." James Edward Smith was a deeply unstable man obsessed with occultism, Santeria, and black voodoo. In 1983, Smith planned a robbery in Houston, Texas, to finance his bizarre lifestyle and ritualistic practices. His target was a life insurance office where Larry Don Rajas, a 44-year-old cashier who was widely loved by his co-workers, was working. Smith walked into the office armed and pointed the gun at Rajas, demanding all the cash. Even though Larry Rajas fully cooperated, peacefully handing over the money and even getting down on his knees to beg for his life, Smith showed no mercy. He shot him point blank in the chest, killing him instantly in front of traumatized co-workers. Smith fled with the cash but was snitched on by informants and captured a few days later. During his time on death row, he became deeply feared by the guards due to his constant, eerie chanting and his threats of cursing anyone who touched him. When the time came to order his last meal in June 1990, Smith didn't want earthly food. He requested a lump of dirt. specifically, soil associated with black magic rituals, graveyard dirt. Smith planned to use the dirt to perform a voodoo ritual that, according to his beliefs, would allow him to cheat spiritual death, reincarnate, or even possess the guards witnessing his execution. The Texas prison system has a strict rule: inmates can only request items that are on the prison's approved grocery list. Since dirt is obviously not food, they denied his request. In the end, the guards served him a single cup of plain vanilla yogurt, which he ate in total silence while staring blankly at the wall. Thomas J. Grasso was an unstable, cold-blooded man with absolute contempt for human life. In 1990, Grasso committed 2 brutal murders for the sole purpose of stealing a few dollars. His first victim was Mildred Sisson, an 87-year-old woman living in New York. Grasso broke into her home, strangled her with a telephone cord, and stole just $8 and an old television set. Months later, he fled to Oklahoma, where he met his second victim, Francesco Frank Delia, an 81-year-old man. Grasso gained his trust only to strangle him inside his own home and steal a small portion of his pension money. Grasso was captured shortly after attempting to pawn the stolen items. His complete lack of empathy during the trial left the jury cold. Grasso used his last meal on March 20, 1995, to request a ridiculously massive and highly specific feast. He wanted to gorge himself before the lethal injection. 2 dozen steamed clams, 2 dozen steamed mussels, half a dozen barbecued spare ribs, a Burger King double cheeseburger, a large plate of spaghetti and meatballs. He specified they had to be canned, Franco-American brand, a whole mango, 2 strawberry milkshakes, half a pumpkin pie with whipped cream. Despite this mountain of food, Grasso used his final words to complain about an absurd detail. He stated to the press, "I did not get my SpaghettiOs, I got regular spaghetti. I want the press to know this." A complete cynic who cared more about the brand of his noodles than the lives he took. Gerald Lee Mitchell was an extremely violent young man who terrorized Texas during the summer of 1985, when he was just 17 years old. Mitchell had no mercy and killed either for cheap thrills or insignificant robberies. His first victim was Charles Marino, a 20-year-old man who was sitting quietly in his car. Mitchell approached him to rob him and shot him in cold blood before stealing his vehicle. Just a few weeks later, Mitchell set up a fake drug deal in a vacant lot with 2 teenagers, Hector Marino, 19, and Mark Padron, 17. When they arrived, Mitchell held them at gunpoint with a shotgun. Even though the boys handed over the money and begged for their lives, Mitchell shot them point blank. Hector died instantly, while Mark managed to survive to testify against him and secure his death sentence. Unlike the massive banquets of other killers, Mitchell went with a childlike sweetness. For his execution on October 22, 2001, he requested an assorted bag of Jolly Rancher candies. Mitchell spent his final hours sucking on sour fruit candies in his cell. Guards reported that the killer was completely relaxed, enjoying his sweets like a child at a playground, contrasting eerily with the pain of the families of the teenagers he gunned down. Velma Barfield appeared to be a sweet, devoted, and highly religious woman in North Carolina, but behind her smile hid one of the coldest poisoners in history. Velma was addicted to prescription pills, and to fund her addiction and hide her thefts of money, she began eliminating anyone who suspected her using arsenic, a slow and incredibly painful poison. Among her victims was her own mother, Lillian Bullard, whom Velma poisoned by putting arsenic in her food to collect an inheritance. She also murdered 2 elderly people she was caring for, John Henry Lee and Dolly Edwards, and finally her boyfriend, Stuart Taylor. The victims suffered days of agony, with intense vomiting and terrible stomach pains, while Velma pretended to care for them lovingly by their deathbeds. She was caught when an autopsy was performed on Stuart Taylor, revealing massive levels of poison in his body. Velma became the first woman executed in the United States since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. For her last meal on November 2, 1984, she rejected any elaborate dishes and asked for something incredibly mundane: a bag of cheese doodles, a 12-ounce can of Coca-Cola. Velma chose to wear pink pajamas for her execution by lethal injection. She consumed her cheese snacks and soda while reading her Bible, claiming up to the last second that she had been forgiven by God, despite having watched her own mother and the people who trusted her die in agony. Cary Stayner worked as a handyman at a motel just outside the famous Yosemite National Park in California. Behind his appearance as an average mountain worker, he was a sadistic predator stalking tourists. In 1999, Stayner unleashed sheer terror by brutally murdering 4 women. His first victims were Carol Sund, her 15-year-old daughter Jelena, and a family friend, Silvina Palazzo, 16. Stainer entered their cabin under the pretext of fixing a leak, gagged them, abused them, and murdered them mercilessly, later burning the car with their bodies inside. Months later, he decapitated his fourth victim, Joa Ruth Armstrong, a young naturalist working in the park. Police finally caught him after finding evidence in his motel cabin. For his execution by lethal injection at San Quentin, Stainer requested a massive final meal, looking for a classic American feast. A large deep dish pizza with double cheese, pepperoni, and mushrooms, a bucket of hot wings, 2 large bottles of grape soda, a pint of Belgian chocolate ice cream. Stainer ate every slice of his pizza with unsettling calmness. In his confessions, he admitted that since childhood he had fantasies about murdering women, and eating that feast before dying was the perfect ending to his twisted story, showing absolute contempt for the pain of the families of the teenagers he destroyed. Let's travel back in time to talk about one of the most feared monsters of Weimar Germany in the 1920s. Peter Kürten, known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf, sowed terror by committing dozens of sadistic assaults and murders. Kürten had no fixed pattern. He targeted men, women, and children alike, using hammers, scissors, and razors. What made Kürten extremely disturbing was his extreme sadism and paraphilia. He derived pleasure from the sight of blood, even confessing that on several occasions he tried to drink the blood of his victims directly, hence his nickname. Among his confirmed victims was little Gertrude Albermann, who was only 9 years old. After an intense manhunt that paralyzed Germany, his own wife turned him into the authorities in 1930 upon discovering his brutal crimes. Kürten was sentenced to die by beheading with a guillotine in July 1931. For his last meal, he requested a traditional banquet but in massive proportions. A huge plate of Wiener Schnitzel, breaded veal cutlets, a mountain of French fries, a bottle of high-quality local white wine. Kürten devoured his dinner with a voracious appetite and even asked for a second helping of schnitzel, which was granted. Just before the guillotine's blade fell on his neck, he asked the executioner with a coldness that makes your skin crawl, "Tell me, after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." Behind each of these bizarre dishes, absurd requests, or silent rituals, we must never forget what truly matters: the immense tragedy these men left in their wake. Shattered families, innocent lives cruelly stolen, and a trail of pain that time can barely erase. In the end, a death row inmate's last meal is the very last vestige of humanity. The system grants them a tiny shred of control before justice is finally served. For some, it was a desperate attempt to save their soul; for others, the final feast of a cynical monster who never felt an ounce of guilt. What about you? If you were in that position, what would you ask for as your last meal on earth? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video and want us to keep exploring the darkest and most disturbing criminal stories in the world, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss our next case. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next video.